Today's daf is Tet Zayin, actually. Tet Zayin in Eruvin, but we are going to start from Tet Vav Amud Bet. There is a new Mishnah. Shiara Shachanata Bebik'ah. If you have a caravan that camped out in a valley, V'ikifua Kele Behema, and what they did was they said, what are we going to do to be able to carry in the valley? The valley is an open place. It's not a place that's permitted to carry normally, because it's an open space. So what do? So they took kalei behema. They took the vessels that were the animals' stuff, and they made a border around their camp. So they make a kind of makeshift mechitza, a makeshift kind of an enclosure. So umitaltelin betocha, and then they can carry inside. Ubilvad shehegader gavoa asarat tefachim, as long as the enclosure that they make is at least 10 tefachim in height. If it's not 10 tefachim in height, then it doesn't count as a fence. Velo yehu peritzot yeterot ala binyan. And you can't have more pirtzot, you can't have more open space than you do closed space. There has to be more closed space and open space in the wall. So there are two rules. Rule number one is that it has to be at least 10 tefachim high. Rule number two is that the perimeter has to be closed, and you can't have more open space than closed. So, and think of, they use big bags or whatever to make the wall. There can't be so much space between them, and they only had a limited number, right? So you have to space them out in a way that there's not too much space in between what you're using to make the wall. Now, kol pirtashi ke'eser amot muteret mipnei shehi kapetach. Any opening in this perimeter that is 10 amot in width is still considered like a doorway, because obviously the perimeter is allowed to have a doorway. The enclosure can have a doorway, but anything more than eser amot, anything more than 10 amot, yater mikan asur. Now, there's a big difference between amot and tefachim. A tefach is a handbreadth, and amma is 6 of those. So when we're talking about 10 amot, we're talking about from here to here. We're talking about your arm, right? This is amma. This is tefach. It's much smaller. So the minimum height is 10 tefachim. The width is measured in terms of amot, right? When it talks about 10 amot, it means it's a large space that's too big to be considered a doorway. So that's what the Mishnah says. Now the Gemara says, Itmar, it was stated parutz ke'omed. Now this is a running argument throughout Masekhet Eruvin. What happens? We know that if parutz mirubeh al ha'omed, if there's more open space than enclosed space, it's no good. What about if it's exactly equal? It's 50-50. If you were to measure it, you would find that there's exactly the same amount of wall as there is breach. Same amount. So what do we do then? So Rav Papa Amar Mutar. According to Rav Papa, that's still good. Rav Huna B'reid Rav Yoshua Amar Asur, and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says that it's not good. Rav Papa Amar Mutar Hachi Agmarei Rahmana LeMoshe. Rav Papa says it's allowed, because this is what Hashem told Moshe. Lo tifrotz rubah. When Hashem gave the oral law to Moshe of how to construct walls, what's considered a wall, what he said was, don't let the majority be open. That was the oral tradition given to Moshe. Rav Huna B'reid Rav Yoshua Amar Asur Hachi Agmarei Rahmana LeMoshe. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says it's not a good wall. It's prohibited to carry in an enclosure if the amount of wall and the amount of breach is exactly the same. Because this is what Hashem said to Moshe: Gedor Ruba, the majority must be fenced. In other words, the question is, was it that Hashem told Moshe, don't let the majority be open? Or was it that Hashem told Moshe, the majority has to be closed? There's a difference, because if it's 50-50, you can't say the majority is open. You also can't say the majority is closed. So if the problem is the majority being open, then 50-50 would be okay, because the majority is not open, because it's 50-50. But if it's a requirement, it's a positive requirement that the majority must be closed, then you haven't met the threshold. You need at least 51% to make the threshold of the majority being enclosed. That's what the machloket is here between Rav Huna B'reid Rav Yoshua and Rav Papa. Now we say like this, Tanan. It was said in the Mishnah, Lo yehu pirtzot yeterot ala binyan. The open spaces should not be more than the constructed space. Ha kabinyan mutar. What's the implication? The implication is if they're exactly the same, if there's the same amount of structure and breach, not more, then it's okay. Tema ha kabinyan mutar. The implication is that Lo tema ha kebinyan mutar. Don't assume that what it means is if it's 50-50, it's okay. Ella ema im binyan yater ala pirza mutar, aval ka binyan mai asur. interpret the Mishnah to mean that if the pirza is greater, it's certainly no good. If the breached part is greater, it's certainly no good. But if the constructed part is greater, that's what you need. In other words, it has to be that the constructed part is greater than the breach in order to allow it to be carried. So, but if that's the case, if we're maintaining that in order for the enclosure to be good enough, there has to be more structure than breach, if that's the case, so why doesn't the Mishnah use the case where they're equal to illustrate that even if they're equal, it's no good? Why does it say if the breached part is greater than the constructed part, it's no good? It should teach us something even stronger than that. Even if they're equal, it's no good until the constructed part is the majority. And it doesn't say that. It uses the example of the breach being the majority, implying if they're 50-50, it would be acceptable. So the Gemara says, Kashya, you're right, it's difficult, according to Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua, who says that actually you need more structure than breach. You actually need that there be more wall than open space. So according to him, why does our Mishnah not use that example to illustrate its point, where it's 50-50? According to him, 50-50 is no good. The Mishnah should mention that, and it doesn't. That's a difficulty. Tashma, come and listen. If a person makes their sukkah roof out of shipudin, out of the sort of kebab sticks, what are those called? Skewers, right? That you use for the fire, for cooking. He uses skewers, or uses the legs of a bed to go over the top of the sukkah. Now, obviously, are skewers acceptable for sechach and sukkot? No, of course not. It's metal, and it's something that you use it's something that you use for cooking. It's a kli. You can't use that for. Is the leg of a bed acceptable for sechach? Obviously not, right? But you put it up there to hold the sechach, right? You put it up there to, like sometimes we'll put other things across to hold the sechach, the cross beams or whatever. So you put this as cross beams. Im yesh revach benehen. Kimotan keshera. If there's space in between let's say for example it's 10 feet long, I don't know, I'm just making it up, and each one of these pasul pieces is 1 foot, and you have 5 of them, so there are 5 feet worth of space covered by your pasul sechach. The other 5 feet is open, right? So if that's the case, you space them out, and there's space in between them, and now you're going to put in between them sechach that's kasher. So since it's 50-50, it says, kashera, it's acceptable. So what do you see then? 50-50 is good. So again, it's another proof for Rav Papa. Rav Papa said, if it's 50-50, it's good. And that's what it seems to say in the Mishnah and Sukkot, right, with regard to Sukkah. So Hachabe Mayeskin and Rav Huna bar Rav Yoshua is not going to give up so easily. He says, I'll tell you that what they're talking about there is Kishenichnas v'yotzeh. That yes, it says that there has to be the same amount of space in between the, let's say, legs of the bed as the legs of the bed itself. So let's say the leg of the bed is a foot wide, then the space has to be a foot wide. Then the leg of the bed is a foot wide, then the space is a foot wide. That's true. But the reality is, v'nichnas v'yotzeh, you're not going, that in order to fit a board in between the two boards that are there, you need a little bit more space than the width of the board itself. In other words, it's talking about where you can put it in and remove it easily. So there's a tiny bit more space than there is board, than there is non-kosher sechach. There's a tiny bit more space. So really? But why can't you just say that it's exactly the same? Amar Rabbi Ami b'ma'adif. It's talking about a person who leaves space, that's all. It's talking about a person who leaves space. So we don't have proof that there's really exactly the same amount of pasul and kasher. It could be that there's a tiny bit more kasher. Rava says, Im hayu netunin erev notno sheti. Sheti notno erev. I'll take it even further. I'll tell you that if the sechach was placed horizontally, the non-kosher was placed horizontally, you put the kasher vertically. In other words, not horizontally, vertically, that's a bad way to put it. If you put it lengthwise, then this was placed widthwise. If it was placed widthwise, you placed it lengthwise. In other words, what did you do? You rested instead of resting. If you imagine the wall of the roof of the sukkah. Let's say you put hockey sticks. I don't know. I'm thinking of anything. Across the lacrosse. It doesn't matter. Across the sukkah, and you space them out. So one end of the hockey stick is resting on the sukkah. The other end is resting on the other end of the sukkah. But now, when you put your kasher, your schach that's actually kasher, you put it the other way, right? So it's resting across. So both ends of your sechach that's kasher are resting on not the sukkah but the actual sticks, right? They're resting on the hockey stick. So what happens? So you have to have a little bit more sechach than you have hockey stick. Why? Because you need the edge of the kasher that's going to rest on the hockey stick, and you're going to need the edge on the other side that's going to rest on the hockey stick. So actually, even though space-wise, it could be that you have exactly the same amount of space in between hockey sticks as you have hockey sticks, right? But the reality is that you have to have more sechach than you have hockey sticks, because the sechach is going to have to hang over the hockey sticks, because you place them the opposite direction as the hockey sticks are placed. So therefore you're going to have more sechach in total. So you can't prove that 50-50 is okay. Could be that you need more kasher than pasul. Tashma, come and listen. Let's say again we go back to the case of the caravan that's out in a valley. The caravan needs to make an enclosure around itself. So what did? They either used animals, meaning they put the camels and they made the camels sit around the camp. So they made an enclosure out of camels. Or, b'ukafot, they used the saddles of the camels. Ba'avitin, they used the pillows that go under the camels. B'shalifin, they used the actual packages that the camels were carrying. Or, b'kanim, they used reeds. B'kolchot, they used vegetables. It doesn't matter what they used. In other words, whatever they had on them, they made a wall around them. Metaltalin betocha. You can carry in the enclosure. What does it say? As long as there is not in between each camel the space of a camel, in between each saddle the space of a saddle, in between each pillow the space of a pillow, and so on. What's the point? In other words, even if it is 50-50, it's no good, because it's saying for every one camel, you have a space the size of a camel. For the next camel, you have another space the size of a camel. So what do you have? 50% enclosed, 50% space, and yet what is it saying? That's no good. You need more camel than space. You need more saddle than space, right? So hachanami kishinichnas v'yotzei. No, I'll tell you that here too, we're talking about where there's even, that it's enough space that you'd be able to put another bag in there, or you'd be able to fit another camel in there, which means there's slightly more space than covered area.
What is the law about?
In other words, because if it were exactly, in other words, if you have a camel here and a camel to the left and a camel to the right, and in between there was exactly the space of a camel, how are you going to get the camel actually in there? You need a little more space to get him in and out. Or if you had exactly the space of a bag, a bag and on the left and a bag on the right, and in between you have exactly the space of a bag, it's going to be very difficult to get it in and out. So we're saying where there's a tiny bit more space, that's why it's no good. But Rav Papa will say that if it's exactly 50-50, precisely 50-50, it's still going to be okay.
I'm talking about the 3 tefachim, so
we're not up to 3 tefachim yet. We're just talking about, we're assuming that there's 3 tefachim is when you want to make 2 things into one.
Right.
We're going to see that next. Right now we're just talking about where the amount of enclosure, the amount of wall is exactly even with the amount of space that is that's involved. So Tashima, come and listen. This is talking about kilayim. Now we learned about kilayim that if you want to sow diverse seeds in the same area, you can make a fence or you can make a wall. And let's say on one side of the wall you're going to plant your vineyard, and on the other side of the wall you're going to plant wheat. I don't know what it is, anything. Okay, so you put up a wall. So there are 3 types of mechitzot. There are shalosh midot b'mechitzot, 3 measurements, 3 categories of mechitzot. Kol shu pachot mishlosha, tzarich shelo yeheh ben ze laze shlosha. Let's say what you did was you took very thin boards, like 1x2s, right? Shelo yizdaker hagedi bevat rosh. So what is it? It says kedei shelo yizdaker hagedi bevat rosh is explaining the measurement. We'll see in a second. In other words, let's say you had 1x2s, and you decide I'm going to make a fence or I'm going to make an enclosure of 1x2s to separate my 2 fields. So you put a 1x2, a 1x2, a 1x2. So those are very thin. not 3 tefachim in width, right? It's less than 3 tefachim in width. So you can't have, let's say you don't have enough to make a solid wall. So what do? You put down a 1 by 2, and then less than 3 tefachim away from that 1 by 2, you put another one. Less than 3 tefachim away from that, you put another one. But if there's 3 tefachim in between them, they're no longer considered sealed anymore. Why? Why are they no longer considered sealed? Because of the principle of lavud. Principle of lavud is that anything that's within 3 tefachim of the next is considered connected to it. So therefore, since anything within 3 tefachim is considered connected to it, if you have 3 tefachim or more, it's a space that a gedi, a goat, could break through. Could come through. That's what it says. It could come bevat rosh. At one time, it could penetrate through. That's not considered a wall anymore. But if it's less than 3 tefachim between the two, even if it's all made out of 1 by 2s and there's a lot of space, so you'll ask me, well, wait a second. There's a lot of space. So how could that not be considered more space than solid? The answer is because it's considered solid because it's within 3 tefachim. Anything within 3 tefachim is still considered solid. Okay, so that's fine. That's the first type of mechitza. Second type is that kolshu gimel umigimel ad daled, from 3 tefachim until 4. In other words, we're talking about how the piece of wood is up to, but not 4 tefachim. Tzarich shelo yeheh ben zeh lazeh kimlo'o, kedei shelo yeheh parutz ka'omed. You can't have that the space next to the board is equal to the board itself, because then you will have what's called parutz ka'omed. The same amount that you have sealed, you have open. The same amount of wall, you have space. That's not acceptable. Can't be the same. Now that's up to 4 tefachim. Up to 4 tefachim. So if the board itself is 3.5 tefachim, you can't have a space next to it that's 3.5 tefachim. It has to be less. Let's say you have 10 boards. Each one is 3.5 tefachim. You can't have the spaces in between the boards be 3.5 tefachim. Once you hit 4, though, it's going to be different. So ve'im haya parutz mirubel ha'omed, af keneged ha'omed asur. Now, it's so bad in this situation where you have the 3.5 tefach boards, and you have a space in between that is 3.5 tefachim. So you have 3.5 of board, 3.5 of space, 3.5 of board, 3.5 of space, right? So it's so much is it not considered a wall, because the boards are not connected to each other because there's more than 3 tefachim in between. So forget that. And the boards themselves, because they're less than 4 tefachim, are not considered significant.
Why is that even a question?
We're going to see. Oh. So therefore, even if you planted on one side of the board grapes and on the other side of the board wheat, it's still considered like they're connected. In other words, the fact that there's a board in between doesn't affect you. It doesn't help you at all. Now, כל שהוא ד' ומ4 עד 10 אמות צריך שלא יהיה בין זה לזה כמלואו, שלא יהיה פרוץ כעומד, ואם היה פרוץ כעומד, כנגד העומד מותר, כנגד הפרוץ אסור. So here you see a difference. If the individual boards are 4 tefachim to 10, from 4 to 10 tefachim, from 4 tefachim to 10 amot in width, okay? A minimum of 4 tefachim. Then what happens is, again, you're not allowed to have parutz ke'omed. You can't have the same amount of empty space that there is board. So let's say you had 10 boards, each one is 4 tefachim. So you have 4 tefach of board, 4 tefachim of space. 4 tefachim of board, 4 tefachim of space. 4 tefachim of board, 4 tefachim of space, all along the area. Okay? Now the problem is, that's parutz ke'omed. Same amount of open space as there is board. Right? But if you want to plant right behind that board and something on the other side of that board, because the board itself is significant, you can do it. It doesn't enclose your whole area. It's not considered to enclose the parts that, let's say you're standing in front of the open space, that's open space. But if where you're planting is actually on one side of this board and you plant on the other side of the board is significant in its own right. It just doesn't help to enclose your whole field because there's too much space around your field. So your field is still considered open. But what's on one side of the board will not be considered connected to what's on the other side of the physical board, because the physical board is significant. The chidush is that even if, let's say you had a situation where you had 4 tefachim with 3 tefachim of space in between, then another 4 tefachim, then another 3, then another 4, then 4 of board, 3 of space, 4 of board, 3 of space. So in the end you have more board than you have space, right? So then even if you plant in front of the open space, right in the front of the open space. And then right on the other side of the open space, you plant something else, it's okay, because we view the whole thing as enclosed now. Even the empty space is part of the wall, because there's more wall than space. So even though physically there's nothing, I plant.
If there are 3 tefachim, even if it's a rod and 3 tefachim and a rod, and like a tiny bit of 3 tefachim, because we consider less than 3 tefachim.
It's not less. I know. I'm saying not less. Exactly 3.
When it's not less.
Not less.
Oh,
Otherwise,
exactly 3.
Right. Exactly 3. That's why it doesn't help you.
So it's not including 3.
Right.
It's like less than 3, not less or equal.
Right. It has to be right. Equal 3 is already separate.
Is also okay. Got it.
Right. Pachot mishalosh is
That's what I was confused.
Pachot mishlosha is always right.
Okay.
3. So what's the point? The point is, so here even the open space is considered part of the wall now, because you have more standing than you have space. So these
it was 4 tefachim.
What?
Oh, what?
Once the boards.
But if it was 4 tefachim and 4.5 of board,
then of course not. Oh, of board. Yeah, so then it's fine. As long as there's more board, In other words, there's 2 ways you can make the enclosure. You can either make the enclosure because what you have is less than 3 tefachim, even though the individual boards are small. Or where you have space more than 3 tefachim in between the pieces, but there's more board than space. And if you want the individual board to be significant, it has to be at least 4 tefachim in width.
But that begs the question: is how big that empty space can be? Like, what's the limit? Is there?
There is a limit. It's going to tell you.
Okay. All right.
That's the next halacha. Nifritza bioter me'eser asur. If there's 10 amot of space at any one point, then it's no good anymore. Okay, so that's the limit. Nifritz. So hayusham kanim hadokranim. Let's say you had some reeds or whatever it was, some sticks in the ground, va'oselahen pe'amil mala, and you made a cross beam over the top. Afilu bioter me'eser mutar. Even if the width of that space now is greater than 10 amot, it's okay. Why? Because it's tzurat petach. What you did was you made a doorway. You made tzurat petach. The top is like this. Now you have you have the form, it looks like the letter chet, where you have an horizontal beam over the top of the 2 vertical beams. Now you have a doorway. Even if it's wider than 10, you're able to maintain it as part of this wall. So the point is, these are all the different specifications that we have with regard to walls. Now this is true with kilayim. With Shabbat, wider than 10 amot, there are many who say that that's no good even with a tzurat petach, but that's another issue. So now we say like this: so mihat, katani mihat. We learn anyway though. Resha in the beginning of the Braita migimel ve'adalet. Ubilvad shlo yehe ben zelazeh kim lo'o. What did it say? That if you had small boards, as long as the space in between the boards is not equal to the width of the boards, you're okay. But what does that mean? Equal is no good. 50-50 is no good. You can't have 50% standing, 50% space. Not acceptable. So that sounds like Tiyufta de Rav Papa. That seems like a very clear refutation of Rav Papa that said 50-50 is okay. So he answers, Amalach Rav Papa, Mai milo o nechnas v'yotzei. And he'll say again, you know what it means that there's space in between the size of the individual boards? What it means is kimlo'o. It means that you could it means nechnat v'yotzeh, that you could easily put in another board or remove another board. And what does it mean if you can easily put in or remove another one? That there's slightly more space. There's slightly more space. It doesn't mean it's precise. It means there's slightly more space in between the boards than there is board. And that's why it's really more. Hachinami mistabra. We also see this as logical because midikatani imaya parutz mirubei al ha'omed af keneged ha'omed asur, because at the end of the Braita it said that if there's more open space than standing pieces, then even if you're planting something right in front of the board, it doesn't make a difference. It's like it's not there. Ha ke'omed mutar. The implication is that if it's exactly 50-50, if it's exactly the same, then it should be okay. Shema mina. Therefore, we can conclude that really 50-50 is okay, because it tells you that if there's more space than board, it's no good. Implying if there's 50-50, it's good. So then the Gemara says, but then let's flip it around. What's Rav Huna Brei de Rav Yehoshua going to say? Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, had said that if it's 50-50, it is no good. Right? So how's he going to deal with this? That it says that if there's more parutz than omed, if there's more open space, implying that if it's the same, it's okay. But what about the end? He'll tell you that it says at the end that if there's more standing boards than space, then even if you're in front of the open space, it's still considered like you're in the enclosure. Because the whole thing is enclosed, right? Even though you're standing in front of the open space. But what does it say? If there's more structure than space. Implying that if it's 50-50, it's no good. It has to be more structure than space. So you can't drive anything. So sefa kashel Rav Papa resha kashel Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua. The point is that there are two conflicting statements in here. Because one of them said that if there's more space than there is structure, then it's not good, implying that if they're 50-50, it is good. And the other statement said, if there's more structure than there is space, then it's good, implying if it's 50-50, it's not good. So either way, we can infer, both inferences can be made from the Braita, so we're stuck. So the Rav Papa lo kasha aidi ditana resha parutz merubela omed tana sefa omed merubela parutz resha the Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua lo kasha aide de ba'el mitnei sefa omed merubela parutz tana. So what does he say? Very simply, they said one of them is what we say lav davka, right? One of them is not precise. So according to Rav Papa, when it says that you need more breach than wall to disqualify the enclosure, that was literal. Okay, and since it used that term, then at the end it said you need more structure than breach, even though that wasn't literal. Really 50-50 is okay. And Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua will say that when it said you needed more structure than breach, that was literal. When it said more breach than structure to disqualify the enclosure, that wasn't literal, because really 50-50 is already disqualified. Okay? So either one, I mean, you could flip it either way. So Bishlam al Rav Papa mishum hachilo ariv lo v'tanelo. Now we understand, according to Rav Papa, why there are three cases in the Braita. Okay? Because, why are there three cases? Because the first case was where the boards are less than 3 tefachim in their width, right? And there can't be more than 3 tefachim in between them. Because they have to make an enclosure, there can't be too much space. The second one was where there's between 3 and 4 tefachim, up to 4 tefachim of board, right? Where it said that they have to be equal, right? There can't be more, or there can't be equal amount of space to the amount of board, which he interpreted that there can't be a little bit more space than board. Because he'll say that in the first case, even though there's more space than board, since they're within 3 tefachim of each other, it's okay. Second case is where there's more space between the boards, where there's more than 3 tefachim of space between the boards, but there's not more space than there is board in total. It's just that there's more space, there's more than 3 tefachim in between individual boards. But there's not more space in total than there is board in total. That's the second case. Okay, so that's 2 cases. However, but according to Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua, why don't we just combine it into one case? Kol shu pachot mishlosha u'shlosha tzarich shelo yehe ben zeh lazeh shlosha. Because it's really the same case, right? It's really the same case according to him, right? Because if you had less than 3 tefachim in width, you can't have 3 tefachim between the boards. And if you had 3 tefachim in width, you also can't have 3 tefachim in between the boards. Why not?
It makes more sense to do it within the constraint of the 3.
Right.
If you do it for more, it's either more or less. Mm-hmm. You can't say, but within the 3 you can say, okay, we're not going to be so, stringent about it.
It's like it's solid, though.
Like it's 3 or just a little bit like 3.
Right.
But the other one says, oh no, it has to be exactly 3 or less. Right? So within just the 3. But if you're talking about the bigger ones, then it doesn't make sense to have it like the 2 views, to be.
Well, still, you're taking the totality of all the space in the whole wall, and the totality of all the boards in the whole wall. It's a different issue. So here, though, what the Gemara is saying is that according to Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua, is there any difference between having the following, between saying that having boards that are less than 3 tefachim, each board is a 1x2, okay, and you have to have them within 3 tefachim of each other. Okay, less than 3 tefachim separate from each other. That's case number 1. Case number 2 is you have a 3 tefach board. You can't have in between that and the next board 3 tefachim. Isn't it the same thing?
It's not the same.
It is the same.
Three.
According to him. No, according to him it's the same. Because why? Because three tefachim separation for 3 tefachim, if the board is 3 tefachim wide, the board is 3 tefachim wide, and the space is 3 tefachim, then according to Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua, that's also going to be no good because there's an equal amount of space and board. No, so he's saying, in other words, it's the same case.
With which is
right. So you should just have 2 cases. You should have the case number 1 is up to 3 tefachim, including 3. If the board is up to and including 3 tefachim, you can't have 3 tefachim of space in between. And if the board is 4, now even behind that board, if you're on opposite sides of the board, you're okay, but you can't have more space in between the boards than there is board, okay? But why does he have 2 cases with the 3 tefachim? Because 3 tefachim, if the board is 3 tefachim and the space is 3 tefachim, it's not going to be good according to him. Rav Papa doesn't have a problem. Rav Papa will say it's 2 things. Because the first case, if the board is less than 3 tefachim in width, you can't have more than 3 tefachim of space because you have to make these boards combine with each other. If you have 3 tefachim, a board of 3 tefachim, and space of 3 tefachim, and a board of 3 tefachim, and space of 3 tefachim, according to Rav Papa, that's fine. Okay, so it's a different case. It's a different situation, according to him. Now, but why, according to Rav Huna Brei Rav Yoshua, is it different?
Based on Rav Papa, or
yeah. So what does he say? So he answers it though. He answers well. He says Mishum. He says Mishum delad dameh b'sulad deresha l'psulad desefa. Psulad deresha kedei shelo yizdaker agedi bevat achat. Psulad desefa shelo yeparutz ka'omed. In other words, he says that you can't compare these 2. He says, even according to me, even though it looks like it's the same case, it's not the same case. Even though in both cases you can't have 3 tefachim of space, in the case where you're using a 1x2, you can't have 3 tefachim of space in between each 1x2. You can't. And when you have 3 boards that are 3 tefachim wide, let's say 9 inches or whatever that is, you can't have 9 inches in between them either. Okay, you can't have 3 tefachim in between them either. Okay, both are true, but for totally different reasons. In the first case, the reason is because if you're using 1x2s, you need to have it considered a closed space. So they need to be within 3 tefachim of each other because it's considered solid. That's a different issue. So that a gedi cannot break through. So that the goat can't break through, it's solid. But when you're dealing with 3 boards that themselves are 3 tefachim wide, why can't you have a space of 3 tefachim in between? It's not because you need to consider it solid. It's not because they need to be united into one board. The reason is because you can't have an equal amount of space and board. That's a different issue. It's a totally different issue. One issue is the issue of that if you have 2 things that are very small, they're right next to each other, we combine them together. The other issue is that in total you can't have an equal amount of space and board. So even according to Rav Huna, even though in the end you'll have a similarity in the cases, that in both cases we're talking about spaces of 3 tefachim in between the boards. But in one case, the reason why space in between the boards is significant is because we're trying to combine the boards. And in another case, the reason why the space between the boards is significant is because in total we need more board than space. Okay, it's still different. It's still different. Okay, now mani, who is the so the question is pachot mishlosha mani. Rabbanani. So what are we talking about here? When we talk about having less than 3 tefachim, whose opinion is this? It's the Rabbanan, it's the rabbis. The Amrei pachot mishlosha amrinan lavud. Shelosha lo amrinan lavud. Because according to the rabbis, lavud, this principle, that if you have 2 items that are within 3 tefachim of one another, less than 3 tefachim separates them, we combine them into one. That's the Rabbanan. Because they say anything less than 3 is combined. So emasefa, what about the end? Kol shu shlosha umishlosha ad arba'ah. We said the second category of board was when the board is from 3 tefachim up to 4 tefachim, but not yet 4 tefachim. Once it reaches 4 tefachim, what happens? The board itself becomes significant, right? So even if the whole area is not considered enclosed, that board is still considered like a wall. That board alone is significant because it's 4 tefachim wide. But Ata'an Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that sounds like the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. The Amar pachot me'arba'a lavud, because he says less than 4 is lavud. In other words, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says it's not 3 tefachim, it's 4 tefachim of space that is considered connected. Less than 4 tefachim, not less than 3. De'i Rabbanan mishlosha ve'ad arba'a shlosha ve'arba'a chadhu. Because according to the rabbis, 3 and 4 shouldn't make a difference. So even a board that's 3 tefachim in width should be significant. Not just a board that's 4 tefachim in width. 4 tefachim in width is a significant measurement according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that any space less than 4 tefachim is closed. So too he'll say, any board that is 4 tefachim is significant. The rabbis should say, since the rabbis say any space less than 3 tefachim is closed, they will say any board that's 3 tefachim is significant. Correct? So since the rabbis go with the number 3, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel goes with the number 4. So why does the Baraita in one case use the number 3 when it's talking about the amount of space? That would be considered a separation between the boards, it uses 3. But when it talks about what size of board is significant, it uses 4. Why is that? So the Gemara says, answers like this. Amar Abaye says, Midresha Rabbanan, Sefanami Rabbanan. Since the beginning is the rabbis, the end is also the rabbis. Umodu Rabbanan, dekol mishra kenegdo, i'ika makom arba'a, chashiv, ve'ila la chashiv. That there's 2 issues here, Abaye says. One issue is how much space is considered a separation. There we say 3 tefachim is separate. If 2 boards are 3 tefachim apart, they're not connected. They're not melded into one. However, when we want to know what is a significant board, not what is a significant space, but what is a significant board, that's 4 tefachim. To be allowed to plant on one side of the board one type of species, and on the other side of the board, another type of species, there you need 4 tefachim, even according to the rabbis. Rava Amar Midasefa Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Reisha Nami Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. I'm going to resolve it the other way. I'm going to say, no, the whole Baraita actually follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. So that's why it says that a board of 4 tefachim is considered significant. Because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that the magic number is 4. So why then in the beginning does he say that you can't have 3 tefachim separating the boards? Doesn't Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say, V'chi amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel amrinan lavud? What about the fact that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that lavud is 4 tefachim, not 3? So why in the beginning of the Baraita does it use the number 3? Hani milei lemala, aval lemata havele kemchitza shehagidayim bokein ba. Lo amrinan lavud. That Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees. When does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel use his principle of 4 tefachim? That's when something's above the ground. For example, when you have a beam, like the korah of the mavoy that we talked about, the cross beam, that doesn't reach the other end of the mavoy. It doesn't reach. So we could say, okay, if it's within 4 tefachim, it's closed. That's what Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel would say. But on the ground, even Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees that 3 is the magic number. Why? Because the bottom line is, any space that a goat can break through is not really a mechitza. How can you call it a closed space? Like we said earlier actually about Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, also with the hanging mechitza teluya. If the wall is hanging down and there's a space under it that's 3 tefachim or more, it's not considered a wall because an animal can go right under that. Nobody's going to consider that a wall. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, when something's on the ground, even he agrees 3 tefachim is the measurement. When it's something in the sky, when it's something above ground, like a crossbeam reaching, there he uses 4 tefachim. So we can actually interpret the Baraita that it's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that when you're talking about space between boards on the ground, even he will agree 3 is the maximum. When you're talking about the size of a board that's significant, then he goes back to his usual magic number, which is 4 tefachim. Now, Tashma come in here. It says that if you have walls, that most of it is made out of openings, doorways, and windows. We had this earlier a few dapim ago. That most of it is made out of doorways and windows. It's okay. It's still considered a wall as long as as long as you have more wall than opening. So the Gemara says sheruban sal kadatach. This doesn't make any sense. Because it says that it says first that the majority is doorways and windows, and then it says as long as the majority is wall, it's okay. But you just said the majority is windows. That doesn't make any sense. What it means is there's a lot of doorways and windows. Mutar, it's still considered a wall. As long as there's more wall than there is opening. Ha-ka-parutz asur. Tiyuvta the Rav Papa. Tiyuvta. You're right, that is a refutation of Rav Papa. Because it says clearly that the only way this wall will be a good wall is if there's more structure than there's more substance than there is space. Okay? So that's tiyuv ta. That's a rejection of Rav Papa who said 50-50 is enough. It doesn't say 50-50 is enough. It says you need more wall than space. But you know what? The law follows Rav Papa anyway. Really? Tiyuv ta vehilcheta? First you refute him and then you say the halacha follows him? In mishum dedaika matnitin kivatek. Tetnan lo yihyu pirtzot yeterot ala binyan hakabinyan mutar. Because since our Mishnah really supports him, because what does our Mishnah say? That it's okay to make a makeshift enclosure as long as there is not more space than there is wall, implying that if it's 50-50, it's acceptable. That falls in line with what Rav Papa says, that 50-50 is acceptable, as long as there's not mirubeh, that the parut is not mirubeh ala omed, as long as you don't have more space than you do wall, you're okay, as long as it's 50-50, and that's why the halacha follows Rav Papa. Mishnah says, "Makifin shlosha chavalim, ze lemala mizeh, veze lemala mizeh, ubilvad shelo yehu ben chevel lachavero shlosha tefachim, shiur chavalim ve'ovyan yeter al tefach, kedei sheyakol asara tefachim." So what is it talking about here? What it means is you can make a wall. There's a picture of it in the back that you can make a wall out of ropes. And look what you do. You make a wall out of ropes. The rope 1, 2, and 3. You have less than 3 tefachim between the ground and rope number 1. Less than 3 tefachim between the ground, between rope number 1 and number 2, and then between rope number 2 and rope number 3.
What kind of rope?
Any kind, So it's rope. It makes a fence. So there are 2 poles, and you drape rope across. So you have clearly more space than you have rope. But the reality is that because they're within 3 tefachim of each other, we look at it as solid. So it's like you have a closed wall there. In fact, I know somebody who makes a sukkah like this. He lives on the top floor of his apartment building. So he used to live in the top floor of his apartment building. So he had a balcony. There was nothing above him. He could make a sukkah. What did he have? He had the railing of the balcony, 1, 2, 3. What? There was nothing above him because, there was no roof. He was open. It was out of an apartment. It was open. On top was open. So what he did was he made a sukkah he had 1, 2, 3 railing. He had railing. It was close to each other. It went up to 10 tefachim. And then he just put poles and he put the sukkah on top of the poles. So he didn't need a wall because it was considered a wall like this. It's exactly the principle here. So we seal it into one entity. However, the thickness of the last rope has to be a tefach. Why? So that you have at least 10 tefachim in height. Because since you're only going to go up to just beneath 9, because you have almost 3 tefachim and a rope, almost 3 tefachim and a rope, almost 3 tefachim and a rope. If that rope is not at least a tefach, you're not going to hit 10 tefachim. You have to hit 10 tefachim in height, but it's no problem that you made it out of space. It's no problem that you made it out of pure space. Okay? Now, similarly, makifin bakanim, you can make a wall out of separate reeds that you stick in the ground around the space. As long as there's not 3 tefachim of space, in other words, this is instead of doing it across, horizontally, you're doing it vertically. As long as they're all within 3 tefachim of one another, you can make an enclosure like that, and it's no problem. They're all connected to one another, no matter how thin they are. B'shiarad dibru divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said this is only talking about a caravan. In other words, if you are lost in the middle of nowhere, they made a special dispensation for people in a caravan that they can make a wall out of only horizontal pieces or only vertical. Normally, a wall is made out of both. You have something going horizontally and something vertical, right? Something vertical and something across. Here, even though you have just sticks in the ground going around, or you have just ropes going across, it's still considered to be a wall, but only for the shiara, only for the people traveling who are in a difficult situation. The rabbis were lenient. V'chachamim omrim lo dibru b'sheara ela b'hoveh. The only reason they told you the case of a caravan was to give you an example, a common example. But really, this way works for anybody in any place. Kol mechitza she'ena shel sheti v'shel erev ena mechitza divrei Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says that any mechitza, any wall that doesn't have a horizontal and vertical component, it's just sticks in the ground with space in between, or it's just ropes across with nothing else, it's not a mechitza. V'chachamim omrim echad mishnei dvarim. The rabbis say either one is enough. Either vertical going around or horizontal going around. Without vertical, like the ropes draped across. With no other vertical poles. The ropes can be draped across 20 amot. It doesn't matter. There doesn't have to be any vertical in between. Because it's considered sealed. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Amar Rav. Rav Hamnuna said the name of Rav. Hare Amru Omed Mirubel Parut B'Sheti. So we've said already that Omed Mirubel Parut. Okay, so we've said already that you have to have Omed Mirubel Parutz, that you have to have that when it's Omed Mirubel Parutz Basheti have Omed, that as long as there's more standing space, in other words, as long as there's more structure, substance, okay, then space, you're good, right? That's with vertical poles, because that's what we were talking about before. Vertical poles, even though there's more, as long as there's more structure than space, you're okay. However, Ba'erev Hamnuna asked, Ba'erev Mai, what about horizontally? What if what you put were these strings across, and they're not within 3 tefachim of each other? Because if they're within 3 tefachim of each other, it's considered sealed. There's space between them. There's more solid than there is space. But there's more than 3 tefachim in between each thing. So they're not all considered to be one entity. They're not one solid entity. Then you would have to have less than 3 tefachim in between each string to make it sealed. Okay? But you have, so you have more than 3 tefachim in between each, but you have a total of more space, more solid than you have space. So is that enough? Is it enough? That's the question. So Amar Abaye says, Tashima, come and listen. Shiur chavalim be'ovyan yeter al tefach, shiukol agol asrat tefachim. We said that when you have this situation with the ropes, that you make a fence with the ropes alone, that they have to go up to 10 tefachim. The last rope has to be a full tefach, right? So that it will reach the number of 10 tefachim. Ve'i'ita, and if it were true, in other words, what he means is that if what Rav Hamnuna is asking about were the case, lama li yeter al tefach, why does there have to be more than a tefach? Le'avid pachot mishlosha, ve'chevel mashu pachot mishlosha, ve'chevel mashu pachot me'arba'a. So he says that. So he says you could space it out differently. What you do is you have less than 3 tefachim from the ground, and you put a rope. Then you have less than 3 tefachim. Then you put another rope. And then you can put less than 4 tefachim and a chayvel mashu. Why will that work? It will work for the following reason: because from the ground up to the first chayvel is 3 tefachim, right? And we're considering that solid. We're considering that solid because it's less than 3 tefachim of space. Between rope number 1 and rope number 2, what will we say? Again, it's less than 3 tefachim, so that's also solid. So that's already 6 tefachim, right? It's already 6 tefachim, and we're considering the whole lower 6 tefachim as solid because it's all within 3 tefachim of each other. Now you can have 4 tefachim and a very thin rope on the top. Because why do you need the 4 tefachim? Because it needs to reach a height of 10 tefachim. So what do you have? You have a height of 10 tefachim, 6 solid tefachim, even though they're not really solid. Legally they're solid, right? And it's okay to even have 4 tefachim at the top. It's no problem. Why is it okay? Because we don't care whether that top rope is within 3 tefachim of the rope before, because we already have a majority of space. We have a majority solid already. From the bottom to the second rope is already 6 tefachim. We're considering solid. So all we need is 4 tefachim to reach our 10, and we can have even the thinnest rope at the top, and it's no problem. Why do you need to have a tefach of rope? Why do they all have to be within 3 tefachim of one another? And then the last one be a full tefach so we reach 10. That implies that what? That you need, that it's not enough to have that the majority is solid. It needs that the whole thing be solid. So that's why even if you're just using horizontal ropes, even if you have the majority solid, it's not enough. You have to have that the whole thing is solid. So even the top rope has to be within 3 tefachim of the second rope, and the second rope has to be within 3 tefachim of the first rope, and the first rope has to be within 3 tefachim of the ground, so that the whole thing is considered one piece. But if the top rope were 4 tefachim elevated, so that it's not considered one piece with the other 2 ropes anymore, even if the 2 ropes on the bottom and the ground are all within 3 tefachim of one another, it's no good.
The principle of the more space than solid doesn't apply.
That's what he's saying. It shouldn't, because if it did, then our case wouldn't be. Then in our case, we wouldn't need to have the top rope within 3 tefachim of the second rope, because the first 2 already make 6 tefachim. Yeah. So he says, "V'tispira." Is it really true? Abaye, is that proof really good? Let's take your case. Hi, pachot me'arba'a hechamokimla. Where are you going to put your larger space? You were saying, do the bottom 2 ropes will be within 6 tefachim of the ground, and then put the 4. But imokimle tata'e, if you put it at the bottom, in other words, between the bottom rope and the ground is 4 tefachim. That's too big. You can't put it there, right? So, if you put it on top, so what are you envisioning? So you're envisioning like this, that the bottom rope is within 3 tefachim of the ground. Second rope is within 3 tefachim of that rope. So from the second rope to the ground is all solid, right? That's the way we described it before. It's considered solid. Now what do you have? 4 tefachim and then a very thin rope. The problem is that very thin rope has air above it, and 4 tefachim of air below it. You know what? It gets nullified. It has air on both sides that's much bigger than it. So it's nullified. Now in the other cases, those ropes are within 3 tefachim of one another, so the air doesn't nullify them because that air is negligible. We don't even look at it. But once you're already talking about 4 tefachim, that air is significant, and it's going to nullify the top rope. So what do we do then? So where's the only place we can put this extra space? It's got to be between the first rope and the second rope. It can't be between the first rope and the ground, because that would be too high, right? It can't be between the second rope and the first rope, because that would be too much space, and then the first rope will be nullified. So it has to be between the bottom rope and the second rope, in the middle. So if that's the case, then what's going to happen? Then you're going to have more space than that. You're going to have. What's going to end up happening is that on one side of rope number 1, because rope number 1 is bordered on one side by the ground, right? Underneath the rope number 1 is the ground. I'll use the space. I'll use this to show you so that you can see it. Okay, the rope is has the ground beneath it, and it's within 3 tefachim, right? So here we go. So this is the case. These are the various cases, okay? So this was the first way. This is the first way. In other words, if it's the bottom, it's too big. If it's here, then it's here, then it's going to nullify the top one. So now we come to illustration number 121. So he says, maybe what you'll say is that it will be the middle part. This is the wide space, right? So what happens? On this side, it's considered solid, right?
Yes,
because it's within 3 tefachim. Over here, it's considered solid also because it's within 3 tefachim. So where's the only space that's not considered solid? This middle space, right? This middle space. So what ends up happening is you're using, this is parutz mirube al ha'omed mishtei ruchot, which omed mirube al parutz mishtei ruchot, which means that this amount of solid is smaller than the space next to it. This amount of solid is smaller than the space next to it.
So it's okay?
Wait, that's what it's asking. That's what you have, right? The only way that you would find that there's more solid than space is if you combine this with this to make 3. So you have 6. And the 4 in the middle gets overpowered. So he's saying, so you're presuming that works. But we've learned before that that's a dispute whether that works or not. We said that normally you have to have all the omed as one solid. You can't have that you have to combine 2 sides with the space in the middle, where the space in the middle is bigger than what's to the left of it, and it's bigger than what's to the right of it. It's only if you combine the 3 tefachim of the left and the 3 tefachim of the right that it's bigger than the space in between. He says, is that what you're saying? That's the only way you could do it. So there's no case actually that our Mishnah could have used. Because if we try to fit that 4 extra tefach, that 4 tefach space somewhere, anywhere we fit it, it's not going to work. It's going to ruin it. Because if we put it on the top, then it's going to nullify the top rope.
Why is it ruin if you have total asar tefachim?
Because the space ends up, if the space of the 4 tefachim is from the bottom, so then there's too much of a space on the bottom. It has to be within 3 tefachim of the bottom. If you put it on the top, because there were 3 spaces, the space between the bottom rope and the bottom. Right? So if you put it on the top, so then what ends up happening is there's 4 tefachim of space under the top rope, and above that is the world, is the shamayim. So there's too much space and just a thin little rope, so that's not good either. That nullifies the top rope. Oh, so you want to sandwich it between the 2 ropes in the middle. So if you sandwich it, though, what's going to happen is there's a big space in between your wall, in the middle of your wall, and only a small space and a small space above and below. That's not good either, or at least that's debatable. It's debatable whether it's good. So we can't use that. So he says, Ella Rav Hamnuna. Rather, Rav Hamnuna was not suggesting. We cannot learn, in other words, from that case, anything with respect to Rav Hamnuna, because Rav Hamnuna's question won't be resolved from our Mishnah. Because there is no other case that we could propose where you're going to have where you're going to have a majority of solid with a minority of space. We thought we could construct a case where you would have a majority solid, with 6 tefachim solid, 4 tefachim considered space legally, and we would say that it's no good. But really, the reason why our Mishnah doesn't use the case where there's 6 tefachim solid and 4 tefachim of space is because there's no way logistically to work it out. Not because that might not be kosher. Maybe it is kosher. Maybe it's acceptable, even with horizontal ropes, to do it that way. It's just that there's no way for us to work it out here. So what are we going to do then? So therefore Rav Hamnuna says, El Rav Hamnuna hachikami bayale. This was the question of Rav Hamnuna. Kigon da'ite machatzelet havi yizayin u'mashu ve'chakak ba'gimel v'shavek ba'daled u'mashu ve'okeme be'pachot migimel. So now this is the case. It's extremely difficult to visualize. The best way to look at it is this: that a person took a mat that was 7.5 tefachim, and he cuts out of the space 3 tefachim. Okay, and then he puts it with, and then so what did he do? So there's less than 3 tefachim from the ground up to where the mat starts. Okay, and there's 4 solid tefachim up here, but because he cut a hole out of the mat, he cut 3 tefachim out of the mat, so there's a 3 tefachim space right in the middle of the hole. So if you were to count up how much you have, these 3 tefachim at the bottom count as a solid because it's less than 3 tefachim between the floor and the first mashehu, the first small amount. So that's 3 tefachim. Up here you have what? 7. You have 4, right? So you have 4 solid on top, 3 solid on the bottom. So that's 7. And then you have 3 tefachim of space in the middle. So in total, do you have a majority solid? Halachically, you have a majority solid because there's 3 on the bottom is considered solid. Top is actually solid physically, 4, and then you have 3 open space. So this is not blended with this because there's 3 tefachim separating them, right?
7. That's what.
This is 4. This is 3. Yeah, because he cut it out. He cut out the space, right? So it was originally 7, but he cut it out. He left a little bit on the bottom. So what he did was he cut out a rectangle so that there's a tiny strip on the bottom, and then a thick strip of 4 with a space of 3 tefachim in the middle, because that's how he sliced it out like that. As you can see, picture number 122. If you're using the illustrations, it's picture number 122. So what happens is, so the 3 tefachim at the bottom, it's solid. 4 tefachim at the top is physically solid, but you have 3 tefachim of open space. This lip of the mat is not connected to this because there's 3 tefachim separating them. Okay? So you have a majority solid, 7 tefachim solid, but you have a space of 3 tefachim. So this is a case where you have omed merube ala parutz. There's more solid than there is open. But there's still an opening of 3 tefachim in the middle. So he wants to know, is that good enough when the wall is entirely horizontal? Where you don't have vertical sticks in the ground, but you have a horizontal thing spread out horizontally. Does it also work to have a space in the middle of your wall? As long as you have a majority solid. That was the question that he raised. Rav Ashi says, no, mechitza tuluya ibayle. What he asked about was a mechitza tuluya, was a hanging mechitza. In other words, normally we say that a mechitza tluya, a hanging mechitza, is where you have vertical. Let's see if they have a picture of the mechitza tluya here that Rav Hamnuna is asking about. Here we go. So you put this mechitza around, and what do you have? You have a space of more than 3 tefachim.
That's mechitza tluya.
What? That's mechitza tluya. Why? Because there's 10 full tefachim of wall. So it's a complete mechitza. So you don't need it to be within 3 tefachim of the ground to complete the wall. The wall is complete in and of itself because there's actually 10 tefachim of wall. But then it's above 3 tefachim from the ground. Okay? So that's called mechitza tluya. It's called a hanging mechitza because it's a complete mechitza. If it were only a 7 tefach mechitza, it would have to be within 3 tefachim of the ground to be complete. But since it's already 10 tefachim, it's just raised above the ground 3 tefachim. So that's mechitza tluya. That's what he was asking about, Rav Hamnuna. So he says, and the answer is that Amar le en mechitza tluya materet ela b'mayim kalu shekilu chachamim b'mayim. As we learned earlier, that a mechitza tluya, a suspended wall, is only kasher when, with regard to water, somebody who has a balcony leaning over water and wants to be able to draw water is able to make 3 mechitzot. Let's say he has a house that has a window overlooking the water. He wants to be able to draw water. So what does he do? He makes 3 walls jutting out from the window. Those walls are 10 tefachim in height, but they don't reach the water. They don't reach the ground. But he can now lower a bucket as long as it's within these walls, even though the walls don't actually hit the water, but the bucket is still directly under the walls, takes the water and lifts the water back up into his window. So he's able to make this bamayim, kal shekilu chachamim bamayim, that they permitted this with water because water, anyway, the space over water is only karmelit. It's not considered really a reshut harabim. It's not really public domain. And they wanted to make it capable. They wanted to allow people to draw water on Shabbat to the extent that they could. So therefore, mechitza tluya wouldn't be the question of Rav Hamnuna, according to Rav Ashi. According to Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna wouldn't have asked about mechitza tluya because we already know that mechitza tluya is not acceptable unless it's over water. Okay, so that, and actually we skipped one line where it said Kidba'amine Rabbi Tavla mirav mechitza tluya ma'u shetatir b'churba, that Rabbi Tavla had asked Rav, is a mechitza tluya, does a mechitza tluya work in a churban? Does it work in a ruin? In other words, if you have a wall that the bottom was broken out, so the wall is still 10 tefachim, but there's space beneath, does that count? Amar le en mechitza tluya materet el b'mayim. This was Rabbi Tavla Rav answering Rabbi Tavla. Rav said to Rabbi Tavla that a mechitza that's hanging, that the bottom is open, doesn't count. If there's 3 tefachim from the bottom of the mechitza to the floor, it doesn't work unless it's over water. So that was what Rav Ashi is saying. Rav Hamnuna was asking the same question with regard to the mechitza that is spread out. In the mechitza that we showed in the picture, the question was this mechitza that's spread out horizontally. It's going horizontally, and it's a mechitza tluya. Is this mechitza acceptable or not? So he was asking the same question. So 2 possibilities: either he was asking about a mechitza that is a mechitza tluya, where there's a space of 3 from the mechitza to the ground, but the mechitza itself is 10 tefachim, or he was talking about a case where the mechitza had a space in it of 3 tefachim in the middle, and he was wondering whether such a mechitza, since its boards are horizontal, not vertical, whether we close that space and say that since the majority is structure, it's good enough, or whether that's only something we say vertically, but horizontally we say that it has to be totally solid in order to be a wall. That's what we'll conclude.